name is Michaelene Fredenburg. I'm the president and CEO of Life Perspectives, headquartered in San Diego, California, although we work nationwide and with a number of international partners. Life Perspectives is dedicated to providing compassionate reproductive grief care. We do that through education, research, and providing healing resources. Reproductive loss surrounds us. We encounter men and women every day who've been impacted, and we find them sitting in our churches too. Every year in the United States, there are 2 million losses through miscarriage and abortion alone. 1 million miscarriages occur, that's about 1 out of 4 pregnancies, and about 1 million abortions. Now, certainly the losses that have occurred are very different, but the way that people experience those losses, the way that they grieve and they heal, and the lack of support that they often find is very similar when it comes to loss from miscarriage and abortion. Additionally, there's about 1 in 160 pregnancies that will end late in pregnancy through stillbirth. About 1 in 8 couples are struggling with infertility. That can be a recurrent and repetitive loss, sometimes every month. About 20,000 domestic infant adoptions occur every year, and certainly we celebrate adoption. But sometimes what we forget is the loss and the grief that's inherent for the birth family, but often for the adoptive family as well, if they have suffered other reproductive losses that led up to the decision to adopt. And then, of course, there's early infant death, and even those children who are born with severe disabilities, where we celebrate the life of that child, but there's also that sense of grief and loss for the difficulties they may encounter or the milestones that they will not reach. And these losses impact men, women, family members, and friends. And yet, even though reproductive loss does surround us, those who experience it often feel isolated and alone, like they're the only one. Now, certainly any loss is painful and difficult to endure. When it comes to reproductive loss, there are some unique factors that do complicate the process and can lead to a prolonged grief reaction or even an unresolved grief that goes on for years, even decades. And so Jaffe and Diamond, who are psychologists and experts in reproductive grief care, have noted that in the midst of the uniqueness of how their clients experience reproductive loss, there are some themes that complicate the grieving process. So in addition to grieving the loss of that child, there can often be the sense that a part of themselves has died, that there's a loss of hopes and dreams for the child, and there's a sense of failure at the most basic level. So I see this in stories submitted to miscarriagehurts.com, but also in the stories that people share with me of the sense that my body failed me. I did something wrong that caused the miscarriage. Or for their partner, maybe I created an environment of stress that led to this. And on our healing website, abortionchangesyou.com, and in stories that I hear from others who've experienced an abortion, there's this sense of failure that they weren't able to be in circumstances where they could continue the pregnancy. And so really what I'm describing here are multiple losses that occur and that complicate that grieving process. Additionally, as we're trying to understand reproductive loss, there's some other obstacles to grieving. And one of them I've already touched on, that sense of feeling isolated and alone, like I'm the only one. This is something that Dr. Doka, who's an expert in reproductive grief, calls disenfranchised grief. So this is a grief that's not culturally acknowledged. It's a loss that's treated as a non-event. And so therefore, the individuals really aren't entitled to grieve. You can imagine how painful this is, how confusing it can be as well. It's something that Lang and her colleagues talk about in their research on perinatal loss. She says, bereaved parents often find it hard to reconcile their intense feelings with society's lack of validation. Lang and her colleagues also talk about the ambiguous nature of a reproductive loss, which is another obstacle to grieving. So when we lose someone that we've known and had relationship with, we have pictures, we have shared memories with others. Perhaps they've given us gifts, or we have tokens, an article of clothing or a piece of jewelry or something that they made. And then often there is a place that we can go to remember them. There's a memorial, there had been a memorial service. But when it comes to a reproductive loss, especially in early pregnancy loss, often we don't have any of this. Maybe a grainy sonogram picture at best, but sometimes not even that. And you can imagine how that really complicates the process of grieving. In fact, one of the things that we hear from parents, and we certainly see this echoed in research, is that there is this fear that their child will be forgotten. And it's understandable when our culture is silent and then when they aren't provided tokens and ways to memorialize. So let's think of this in the context of Dr. Worden's task of grieving. So you're probably familiar with Dr. Worden's work. He's one of the most foremost experts on reproductive loss, on just loss in general, and then this can be applied to reproductive loss. And so Dr. Worden talks about grief as rather than this linear, orderly fashion, right? So there's the loss, and then we move through these orderly stages of grief. That loss is really messy, it's chaotic. So think of it more like messy circles. And in the beginning, it's just hard to even function. And then maybe, okay, we kind of have a breath, but then there's a memory or an anniversary, and we're right back there in this hard work of grieving. And so Dr. Worden, because really there's tasks that we work on in adapting to life without that person. And so these tasks are accepting the reality of the loss, processing the pain of the grief, adjusting to the world without that person, and then finding an enduring connection that allows us to then embark upon a new life. So let's think of these in context of the obstacles to grieving. So with a disenfranchised loss, a loss that is not acknowledged, you can imagine how difficult it would be to really work on any of these tasks, but in particular, the accepting the reality of the loss and processing the pain of the grief. So when someone hasn't even said that they're sorry for our loss, you can imagine how that can make it really difficult. And when we're not allowed to talk about it or given space to do that, how do we then work through the emotions? And that ambiguous nature of the loss, how then do we find a healthy and enduring connection to the deceased? We'll answer that question in just a moment. But Dr. Doka also says this beautiful statement, I think, grief is the price you pay for love, but how you grieve is not necessarily a measure of that love. So in essence, everyone is unique in their reaction. And I think you've already experienced this in your grief work and in supporting others who are grieving. We're all different. We're going to react differently. There isn't a right or wrong way to grieve. There is no set timeline, and there's no shoulds. And this is really important for us to remember when we think of setting the stage for healthy grieving. So what are the things that we can do? Certainly acknowledging the loss. Right now, we're undoing that impact of the disenfranchisement. We're enfranchising that grief. We're giving them permission to grieve. And in doing so, you're normalizing their reaction. Grief is a normal reaction to loss. And then providing tokens of remembrance. So what are some really specific things then that we can do? So in responding to losses, here are some things that we can say and that we can do that will help to bring comfort and also assure the individual that we support them and that we're remembering their children with them. So what can we say? We can say something as simple and profound as, "I'm so sorry." And when I say this to men and women, almost all the time they tell me no one has ever said that to them about a child that they had lost through miscarriage or abortion or stillbirth. You're not alone. Assuring them they're not the only one. There is comfort in that. Asking them how they're doing and allowing them the time to answer that question, to begin to process their emotions. And then reassuring them that it's okay to fill in the blank, right? To cry, to be angry, to be numb, to be confused. Perhaps I have mixed emotions. Perhaps I feel a sense of relief and regret, or relief and sadness. That can be really confusing, but it's so normal. And letting them know that everybody grieves differently. This is quite a relief to hear this, right? It gives us permission to grieve in our own unique fashion and in our own unique timeline. This is also quite a gift to couples and to families who often miss each other because they're thinking the other person isn't grieving, or because they're not grieving the way they are, maybe they're not feeling it as intensely. And so letting them know we're all going to be different really allows that permission for each person to grieve uniquely, to have their unique connection and their unique process. And this really helps. We see in research that couples and marriages are at risk when it comes to a reproductive loss. But giving them this information and giving them permission to grieve differently can really help to mitigate that risk. And then certainly offering and giving them resources. And what can we do? Display empathy and compassion. Always include the partner. I can't tell you how many men say to me that no one ever acknowledged their loss. Send a sympathy card, whether that loss was recent or you just recently found out about it. This helps in accepting the reality of the loss and also provides this important token of remembrance, which then you can discuss further. Other things that they would like to do to memorialize or remember their child. Then check in from time to time. And if you know of anniversaries, reach out on those anniversaries. Back to memorialization, because this is part of how we bring comfort and we help to mourn with these individuals and assure them that their child will not be forgotten. Certainly a funeral service, a memorial service is very appropriate and can be done at the time of the loss, or perhaps this is something that happens later. Or it can be a communal. So perhaps your church would offer annually a time where anyone who's been impacted by a reproductive loss could come and remember and honor those children. If the loss was recent, it happened now, you can suggest or ask if they would like to bury their remains, and you can help to facilitate that with the hospital or healthcare provider. Providing a place of memorial on the grounds of the church, a garden, a fountain, a statue. Maybe the parents could plant a tree of their own at the church or on their property at home, giving them a pin, a bracelet, a candle. And of course, your imagination can go with this, but all of these allows a place for a person to go to or an item for someone to look at, and more than anything to know that we remember with them. And please, in addition to these tips, use Life Perspectives as a resource. We offer a number of courses, We have our healing websites that I mentioned, abortionchangesyou.com and miscarriagehurts.com, and memorial items as well. Thank you for coming alongside those who are grieving, offering them comfort and hope, and assuring them that you are remembering their children with them. Thank you so much.